Hello, Thrive Nation. I'm trusting you Thrivers are doing well. I've got a very special guest, and I've been waiting for this show for a long time because I really want to unpack inflammation. I want to unpack omega-6s, omega-3s, free fatty acids. I really want to talk to a specialist, and his name's Dr. Paul Clayton, and I've been using a product, an omega-3 product that has probably been my best omega-3 in 22 years as a physician in my other life. And I've seen the changes, I've felt the changes, and we've recorded the changes through a company called Zinzino. And so welcome to the show, Dr. Paul Clayton.
Hi, Steve. I'm happy to meet you at last.
Great. And Dr. Paul is a clinical pharmacologist, a pharmaco-nutritionist. He's got an incredible blog. I'm really going to put the link to his website. And I've watched a lot of his YouTube videos that have been very enlightening. And so we're going to take some deeper dives into some of the weeds on omega-3s. But Dr. Paul, I want to give us an overall sort of framework that we can just put people in about dis-ease or disease, and the primary etiological factors from inflammation to autonomic dysregulation to hormonal imbalance. What are the primary silos or pillars that you'd sort of want to set a frame for people that are listening out there when it comes to chronic diseases?
Okay, before we get involved in the details of pathogenic mechanisms, can I just take a moment to step back and give you the 30,000-foot view?
Sure.
Because you really, in order to understand what's going on now, you have to know a little history. If you don't know where you've come from, you have no way of knowing where you are. Sure. And I think that's particularly true in politics. It's true in the life sciences. It's true in general. We look around, and our normal is that as we get older, we see that people become more at risk of various chronic degenerative diseases, all the way through from metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular, oncological issues, autoimmune disease, allergies. And we have come to accept that as normal. We've come to accept that as an intrinsic aspect of aging. And that kind of fits into a rather a 19th century concept of what aging is, or early 20th century. And that is it is to do wear and tear. The myth goes, well, we discovered antibiotics and immunizations, and then everybody started living longer. And then because we were living so long, we started wearing out. And that's where this concept of entropic disease comes from. Well, of course, that's all nonsense, because if you take the historical long view, what you can see is that 150 years ago, there were well-documented cultures, such as the mid-Victorian English, who lived as long as we do today, and who actually lived healthier for longer than we do. And when they aged, they didn't quite age in the way that we do. They died in the main of infection, trauma. They had relatively little in the way of chronic degenerative disease. Now, we actually know this because the doctors of the day were butchers and barbarians, so not much has changed there. But one of the things that they could do, they couldn't cure these conditions any more than we can now. But in order to make themselves at least look respectable, they would do lots of autopsies. And so the doctors of the day, even the humble country GPs, were doing 2, 3, or 4 autopsies a week. And they became very fine pathological anatomists. I mean, really good. And when I look at their files, and I've been through thousands of them, they're better than many of my students could put together today. Now, they didn't have the technical advantages that we do. They didn't have the ability to measure 5,000 biomarkers. They couldn't do early screening. They didn't have access to modern drugs or surgery or anything like that. And still, these people were living for a healthier life, longer than we do. Their health expectancy was longer than ours. So we have plenty of records of mid-Victorians in their 80s, even in their 90s, who are still capable of going out and working a full day of work in the fields come harvest time. Mm. When they did come to an end, they would go to a workhouse. That was the institution. And they were, the name reveals what its purpose was. They had to work to support themselves. And We know that they did, the records tell us, until the weeks, days, or hours before they died. And as I said, when they died and they were autopsied, well, those doctors couldn't detect diseases as early as we can. But at the point of death, they were perfectly capable of diagnosing cancer or a stroke, or something like that. And they did so without prejudice. So we have every confidence in their records. The chronic degenerative diseases, which seem so universal and so normal to us, were not normal in that population.
So what you're trying to say, Doc, is we've got to set a new normal, that people have sort of got a paradigm or a frame of reference, or they're looking through the world through these lenses, that as you age, you get these chronic diseases, obviously sort of indicated by, I think, is it 60% of the American population has one chronic disease. And I think, 30-40% have multiple chronic diseases. Is that the picture and the vision we've got to now change so that people have a different frame of reference?
Absolutely. We have accepted this idea that we've become progressively sicker as we get older with a chronic degenerative non-communicable condition. We accept the idea as normal that we will require more and more polypharmacy. We accept the idea as normal that the last 10% of our lives, if not more, we will be in a state of progressive clinical dependency. The mid-Victorian example tells us that that is not the case. And we know of vestigial groups alive today, hunter-gatherers, such as the Hadza, horticulturalists, such as the Tsimane in Bolivia, and they are being investigated very thoroughly by a wonderful, I think, bioanthropologist, bioepidemiologist called Michael Gerben, who's at the University of California in LA. And what he's been able to show is that these people who have a life expectancy that matches ours, as they get older, their blood pressure does not increase. They do not become more insulin resistant. In men, the prostates do not grow. In men and in women, there is little, if any, brain shrinkage or hypothalamic shrinkage, which of course we know now is the forerunner to Alzheimer's and dementia in general. So they manifest the same pattern of aging as the mid-Victorians do. We don't have to go back to the paleo stuff because none of that's documented. These are documented cultures. And as they age, they do not show this kind of wear and tear, this entropic loss of function, viability, and health that we do, which leads you to one conclusion, and one conclusion only. The signs that we see of an aging population, the things that we are used to, is nothing to do with wear and tear. And by the way, that's a model that only really applies to mechanical situations. We are self-healing, self-repairing. We don't wear and tear that location. And you can look at this from another perspective. And now I want to cite the work of the great Barry Popkin, who's at the Population Center in North Carolina. And Barry published the first of a series of papers in 91 or 92, where he first talks about the nutrition transition. And what that is in every country which moves away from its traditional diet and moves towards adopting the modern and an increasingly ultra-processed diet, you see this catastrophic decline in health expectancy. You see an enormous increase in the frequency of the chronic degenerative diseases and a decrease in latency. That is, you see them occurring in younger and younger groups of patients. So bear with me just one moment. I'll just give you one example. Type 2 diabetes. I first went to medical school in 1968. Edinburgh, wonderful university, or it used to be. And we were taught then that type 2 diabetes was a disease of relative old age. We would expect to see type 2 diabetics being diagnosed in the 80s and 70s, maybe. And then, of course, the landscape has changed comprehensively because over the last 50 years, we've seen type 2 diabetes, not type 1, type 2, emerging in patients in their 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, teens, preteens, for God's sake. And because once you're diabetic, your risk of a number of different pathologies increases very dramatically. We've seen decreases in the age of onset of, for example, dementia. It's fallen by 15 years in the last quarter century, beginning a huge increase, a decrease in the latency of depressive illness, which is very connected, as you know, to dementia. We see, if we care to look around, once these scales fall off our eyes, we see a kind of a slow motion holocaust. People are dying in droves prematurely, which means from preventative diseases. And IMHE, which is the United States Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, and who crunch very, very big data indeed, they've come to the conclusion that, well, dummies, it's your diet, it's poor nutrition that is doing this. So here we are. We actually know what the problem is now, but the stakeholders, and this is largely the pharmaceutical industry, make very good money out of selling palliatives, ways to treat the symptoms of these diseases, and they're not at all interested in examining the prospect of creating a genuinely healthier population, because that's where food comes in, that's where nutrition comes in. So that's the battleground, that's the terrain that we're looking at. Now, if you want to start looking at specific pathogenic mechanisms, we can drill down into those in a way that will allow us to develop and design and implement specific antidotes.
Great. So I just got one comment. Is it not big food, big pharma, big financial institutions that are all benefiting? They've got people on sort of a rat race where you're now getting enslaved to debt. Now you're enslaved to debt. So you've got to work long hours, or you got to go to university. And when you start working long hours, you don't have the time to prepare the food. So you buy the industrial processed food through the industrial ages. And so what happens is there's more enslavement to these big organizations that are not really benevolent at all. They don't have your best interests at heart. They've got their best interests at heart and their profits and their power and their interests. So is it not these big organizations that have really happened in the industrial age that have taken and people have given away their own personal autonomy to these organizations, and then find themselves enslaved into a system where they eat badly and enslaved to finances, stress levels go up, and it's this perpetuating problem they battle to get out of?
I think that you're right to the extent that health is profoundly political. And the way in which we attempt to deliver healthcare is profoundly political, or at least it has been extremely politicized. That's absolutely correct. And you conjure up an idea of us as relatively helpless individuals being tumbled around inside this gigantic socioeconomic set of machinery, which leaves us all victims. And there is a great deal of truth in that. There is a great deal of cross-holding economically. And if you look at the people who sit on the boards of these different types of organizations, there's a lot of cross-holdings between big food and big pharma. And the major financial institutions, and there's really only about 100 of these companies that control a very large percentage of the global economic space. They do talk to each other, and they do, I'm sure, have an awareness of what this picture actually looks like. They're not interested in altering it at all. So the pharmaceutical industry, which calls itself laughably the ethical industry, and the big food industry, yes, they are in bed with each other. The pharmaceutical industry, I think, is really happy about a food industry that creates an enormous volume of chronic degenerative disease, leaving people cash cows and helpless for the pharmaceutical industry to sell their toxins to. The food industry, I think, is very happy that the pharmaceutical industry is there because it covers up to a large extent the damage that these foods are doing to our public health. So there's a ghastly convergence of interests here, which leave us all as victims. It's a prison with two walls, if you like. My answer to that is that it's a prison that's surprisingly easy to escape from. All you have to do to escape out into the green fields of freedom is to stop buying modern ultra-processed foods. They are the tobacco of today. Stop buying these terrible products. Learn how to, if you've ever known, if you've forgotten it, if you haven't ever learned it, learn how to cook and work with basic produce. And that is the most important single thing you can do to escape from this ghastly nexus of two major industrial sectors who do not have our good at heart, not at all.
But I think it's very simple what you're saying, Dr. Paul, but it's not easy at all. And I think there's a profound difference. People say that lowest hanging fruit of the tree is you just change your diet, you just change your food. I've been dealing with patients, for 22 years for them to take hold of that low hanging fruit and sustainably put those habits in place when it is far easier to go to the supermarket and buy the processed food and eat the processed food because of the narrative that they've been taught of quicker, faster, more convenient. I've got more time for hedonic pleasures, as well as this lie of this financial sort of stepping up the ladder and getting more financial prosperity as a way of success. I'm successful because of my financial status. It seems very difficult for people to adopt that, not because it's not, it's not easy, but it's not simple. And the drivers of how we change our eating habits and our nutritional choices, what are those internal drivers that we need to work on? The why of people saying, hang on, I'm going to learn how to cook. I'm going to go to the farmer's market. I'm not going to eat the industrial foods. I'm not going to have the seed oils. In fact, we are not going to eat out often because these restaurants are using processed foods and rancid oils. So what are those internal drivers? Because we need to look at why are people often not prepared, even with the knowledge and the education of the processing of foods. Why do not they don't make that change sustainably?
Well, I think that you've partly answered your own question. We are time poor, many of us, and we may be financially not very well off either. And the way in which these food companies work is they have enough leverage to be able to persuade governments to create a system of subsidies, which make, for example, a burger and fries actually cheaper to buy than basic produce, which is a nonsense. This is a complete distortion of the economic field. And another problem is that we have been sold a poisoned chalice. These foods are, let's not fool ourselves. Let's not be puritanical about it. They're really good to eat. And the reason for that is that the food industry utilizes a series of techniques to develop foods which are, at the very least, quasi-addictive. They show many of the characteristics of addictive substances. They use a technique called bliss point technology, which you may have heard me talk about, and which enables them to produce variations of these ultra-processed foods, which are very difficult for us to resist. And once a child has been exposed to those types of foods, their entire palate starts to become corrupted. And through a rather unfortunate turn of events, you end up with changes in the brain which degrade appetite further. So we all of us end up in something of a vicious cycle. To break out of that, I have some colleagues who have developed an addiction treatment model, which they've brought across from the treatment of alcoholism and various types of a drug addiction, and they use that and to help people to break free of these food addiction types of behaviors. It requires complete withdrawal for a period of at least 10 days. It takes about that time for your metabolism and actually your brain chemistry to start to recover to the point where you're now able to make slightly more considered and health-oriented decisions about what you eat and how you eat. So this is not an easy thing, but it can be done.
Okay, good. Well, I think there's got to be always hope. And I've seen the minority of my clients and patients over time make these changes and make them sustainably. So I think there's always, Coach, one of the techniques, and I don't want to go into the interventions because I do want to set those silos and those pillars up, but it is the use of a health coach who holds you accountable, who shares your journey, walks a journey with you, who you trust. And you've got a partner in this, because if you don't have partners or groups or communities to help you with this journey, it becomes a difficult road. But give us the overall framework of dis-ease or disease and chronic diseases in terms of the etiological factors that you found and how we can address them.
Okay. Well, let me go back to Barry Popkin just for a moment and recrystallize his idea of the nutrition transition. So here we are, we're downstream of the transition. We're eating this modern ultra-processed diet. And what do we see? We see diseases of civilization. That's what we call laughably, because there's no sign that I've seen anywhere, no evidence that we're any more civilized than we were 2, 3, 4, or 6 generations ago. I think that concept of diseases of civilization has a kind of a resonance. People hear it and think they understand what it means. But it is very amorphous. It does not allow us to to start to develop antidotes or specific countermeasures. It's too woolly. So what I've been doing for the last, oh, God knows how many decades, a long time now, is trying to tease this mass of data apart to ascertain exactly what is it about the modern diet and lifestyle that makes us ill. Once you get to that point, you can then begin to propose very specific countermeasures. And I think we're at that point. So there appear to be four major horsemen of the nutritional apocalypse, is how we refer to them rather loosely. And one of them is chronic inflammatory stress, which you know about, everybody knows about or thinks they know about because it's had quite a lot of airtime. It's actually much more complicated than most people think they know. It's actually more complicated than I know. I mean, the machinery is extremely complex. And I feel that I have an idea of the outlines of it, but I'll be frank with you, I don't know all of the details of it. But chronic inflammatory stress, at the end of this very complex cascade of biochemical and cellular events, leads to the excessive release of a group of enzymes called matrix metalloproteases. And what these do is they destroy the microfibers that constitute the extracellular matrix, which is nothing to do with Keanu Reeves. It is everything to do with a three-dimensional mesh of microfibers that holds us together. It permeates every cubic micrometer of the body, and it holds your cells in the correct orientation so that they can communicate and work collectively as a tissue or as an organ. Now, if you're making too much of these matrix metalloproteases, that mesh starts to fall away, and healthy tissue starts to become disorganized, it falls apart and disintegrates. The other horseman that rides side by side with chronic inflammatory stress is type B malnutrition. Now, we were designed to be hunters and gatherers and to work with our hands and with our backs. Very few of us do that anymore. And so you end up with this situation where urbanites and metropolitan people are running at about 2,000 kilocalories a day on average. And if a lot of those calories are empty, as they are now, if you're eating in the modern diet, your intake of a wide range of micro and phytonutrients, and God knows everything else is low. That's type B malnutrition. You're low in vitamins, trace elements, phytonutrients, fiber types, methanogens, cyanogen groups. It's because conditionally essential amino acids, conditionally essential amino sugars, the list goes on and on and on. And what that does is that degrades your ability to repair and to regenerate tissue. So here you've got chronic inflammatory stress dissolving the matrix far too rapidly. You've got type B malnutrition, which hinders your ability to replace it. So over time, there is a net loss of this matrix, leading to the progressive erosion or destruction and loss of functional healthy tissue. And that is one of the hallmarks of chronic degenerative disease. So that's a part of it. Then you've got two more issues. You've got dysbiosis, thanks again to the big food companies who have progressively removed prebiotic fibers from our diet, leading to dysbiosis, which is now almost universal. What that does is it creates, amongst other things, chronic inflammatory stress in the intestines, specifically in the lower intestine and the colon, leading very directly, not just to IBS and IBD, but to endotoxemia, non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, which now affects an astonishing 1 in 4 of the world's population, and a whole range of other problems, which are caused by the fact that you're getting these macromolecules entering the blood from the gut, which they should not be doing, leading to immunological problems, leading to the translocation of gut microbes into the urinary tract, into the joints, into God knows where else, and causing all kinds of problems, and triggering a raft of different pathologies. So that's 3 out of 4. And the fourth is glycemic mismatch. The vast excess of glucose that is being poured into our bloodstreams because of our huge intakes of sugars and simple starches, and our very low levels of physical activity, which means that the sugar is not being abstracted from the bloodstream into skeletal muscle, which is a far more important glucose sink than the liver ever was. So it's piling up in the bloodstream, overwhelming the liver's ability to act as a sink. And then you're moving into hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and all the rest of those things. So these 4 mechanisms are enough to explain the bulk, the vast bulk of the tsunami of chronic degenerative disease that is now overwhelming healthcare systems everywhere. Sounds grim. is actually extremely optimistic, I think, because now that we've identified what these 4 mechanisms are, we can counter each one of them specifically and highly effectively.
Right, let's take a pull on 2 different strings, on the inflammation, and then secondly the glucose, because I think there's some specifics I want to talk about: omega-3s, omega-7s, omega-6s, the ratio, the positions of SN1, SN2, SN3. Just some information for people who say, listen, I'm unsure about omega-3s, I'm unsure about which one, I'm unsure about the science of it, and how it affects our inflammation from palmitic acid to stearic acid. Give us sort of the rundown on how important omega-3s are, and the details that I've sort of just mentioned.
Well, the inflammatory cascade, if it starts anywhere, it starts with, it starts at the cell membranes. It starts at the cell membranes of your immune cells, but your other body's cells as well. And you, depending on what the trigger is, you have an enzyme called PLA2, which comes along and starts to break down phosphatidyl phospholipids, which form the basic cellular membrane, which is a lipid bilayer. It's these phosphatidyl phospholipids, which are amphiphilic, and they line up in a particular way with the hydrophilic heads on the outside, the lipophilic tails on the inside. But once PLA comes along, it starts to break these molecules down, releasing fatty acids, which are then metabolized by a group of other enzymes into eicosanoids and licotrienes and prostaglandins and muresins and protectins and all kinds of things. And the breakdown products depend on what the parent fatty acid was. So if you're starting off with arachidonic acid, then you end up with mediators which are predominantly inflammatory. If you're starting off with EPA, DHA, those are your highly unsaturated omega-3s, you end up with mediators that are predominantly anti-inflammatory. And so the balance of pro and anti-inflammatory mediators that you produce, once the cascade has been started, which it might be by a pathogen or by physical trauma, then it's the balance of these mediators that will determine whether you will have a healthy immune response, a healthy inflammatory response, resolve the stressor, or whether you will go on to have a chronic inflammatory sequence, which is not healthy at all, and which leads to a chronic degenerative disease. So it's the 6-to-3 ratio that is very, very important. Now, it's not the only factor. I don't want you to leave that impression at all, because there are other nutrients that have the ability to modify this cascade at different points. And this is where the polyphenols come in. Now, we used to eat a diet which, as far as we can tell, left us with 6-to-3 ratios in our cell membranes that were probably between 2-to-1 and 5-to-1. And if you have that kind of ratio, you will not have chronic inflammatory stress. That's a pretty healthy configuration. But we also know that there are places in the world where there's no cold water fish, no seafood which contains these valuable omega-3s. And yet, if you look at the traditional diets, you can see, well, you go to India, for example, as a case in point, you'll come across centenarian Hindus who are actually doing pretty well, who are clearly not suffering from chronic inflammatory stress. And of course, that was a huge paradox when I first went there. And all I wanted to do was to find out what was going on. And once you start learning how to cook Indian food, it's very obvious they're consuming enormous amounts of polyphenols. And even if you have a bad 6-to-3 ratio, and we know now that they do, they've got ratios which are far higher than you'd find in Europe, for example, or even in North America. If you're consuming lots of polyphenols on a daily basis, you're heading off, you're blocking this inflammatory sequence further downstream. It's a perfectly acceptable alternative. There is a problem though. If you're eating lots of the right omega-3s, then you build these things into your cell membrane and they stay there for a while. So you have a buffering system. The polyphenols, if you're relying on polyphenols to block the inflammatory cascade, which they do, it's a little bit more tenuous because polyphenols are generally regarded by the body as foreign. Most of them are broken down, metabolized, excreted fairly quickly. So you need to eat them on a daily basis. Now, if you're eating a traditional Indian diet, then you are consuming lots of polyphenols, and that works just fine. But what we see now in the younger generations, the millennials and after, who've moved into the cities, who want to work for IT, call centers and things like that, who do not want to be associated with the diet their parents ate because they regard that as primitive. They're moving to the modern diet. They have no omega-3s to start with. Now they have no polyphenols. And this generation, they have the worst public health you've ever seen. And many of them are dying before their parents. Now, we've seen this pattern before. We saw this in Italy, for example, where if you look at the inhabitants of in the Apennines, in the mill villages, you'll come across villages where the average age is 90 plus. And they're still doing pretty well. But now they're getting really old. They're starting to die. And the Italian government has no idea what to do with them because their kids who went to the city died of old age. They already died. And their grandkids are too busy looking after the great grandkids to look after their grandparents. So these cultures are being left to die out. There's really no one there to help them.
Sure. Reminds me of my grandparents in the little small separate villages that we used to go to, that they were going in their 80s and you know, they were cooking their own food, and there were a lot of polyphenols. And I remember my dad used to always say they used to eat meat once a week. They couldn't afford anything else. They had a little bit of fish maybe once a month, but it was just this bone broth, and they used to cook these bones that they could afford. And it was always the greens, and that they used to call this thing called horta, which is all these wild green sort of leaves, and then they would soak it and then cook it. And, you know, many times it was just onion and tomato and greens, night after night after night.
Well, you can't live on that, of course. I mean, you do need a certain amount of calories. You do need a certain amount of protein. And, you know, I'm very well aware of the fact that as we get older, people say you shouldn't be eating too much protein, because if you have a cancer in situ, lots of protein, IGF goes up, IGF-1 goes up. And then you think, well, are we going to be promoting cancer growth in this older population? I would say no, if your nutrition is in the right place. And I also find it very puzzling that these same people will say, oh, it's okay to eat plant protein. Really? The amino acids are the same, whether you're getting them from an animal source or from a plant source. So why is animal protein more dangerous? Well, I think maybe two reasons. Particularly, it depends on how you cook it. The Victorians, mid-Victorians, the blue zone that I was partly instrumental in identifying, ate enormous amounts of animal protein, but they cooked it in a certain way. That was a culture where the bulk of the population had fuel poverty, and so they cooked low and slow. They stewed meat, basically, rather than roasting, frying, or barbecuing. So it never rose above 100 degrees. If you look at the recipes, my golly, they always cooked with onions, and onions contain sulfur compounds that inhibit the formation of cooked meat, carcinogens. So they're eating meat, which is actually safe. And I think that another factor which has influenced people's feelings that it's got to be plant and not animal protein is, well, plants do contain things that animal proteins don't. They contain, amongst other things, prebiotic fiber. If you don't have prebiotic fiber, if you're getting all your protein from animals, you're going to have dysbiosis. And the biggest meta-analysis that we know of says if you don't have enough of those, if you really do have dysbiosis, that's going to increase early death by 30%. And you can break that down into heart attacks and strokes and colorectal cancer and liver cancer, breast cancer. So I think it's okay to eat meat, even in older ages, providing you're also consuming the prebiotic fibers and providing you're not eating the meat in the way that we do because of our time compression, you know, barbecuing and flash frying and deep frying. If you're stewing it, you know, like stroganoff or something like that, then I don't think it's a problem at all. Men and women, humans are omnivorous. We are opportunistic omnivores. And I think that if you know how to eat these foods, how to prepare them, you can eat just about everything and anything.
Great. Let's go back to the omega-3s, omega-6s, and let's talk about...
I'm sorry, we moved a long way away from that.
No problem. Let's talk about omega-9s. I see sometimes the tests that we do, some people have real deficiency in omega-9s, and some of them have got too high omega-9s. And talk about how we measure polyphenols in the body. What would good measurements be if someone's having enough polyphenols, you know, because they're going to ask that question. So why don't you expand on that, Doc?
I got to say that the associations between omega-9 status and long-term health issues, that's not at all clear. I mean, we have this idea that omega-9s are good for you because we know that olive oil is good for you. That's part of the Mediterranean diet. It's associated with better health expectancy. But you can make oleic acid in your own body as you know. It's not an essential fatty acid. And I'm beginning to think that what's more important in olive oil are the amphiphilic polyphenols. And to give you an example, the amphiphilic polyphenols are fantastic chaperone molecules in the body. And they are the same molecules that act as chaperones in the marine food system, food networks, that allow the transfer of these very fragile, highly unsaturated omega-3s from their origin, which is in the marine algae at the base of the food chain, all the way through, you know, the krill, the small pelagic fish, the larger fish, the marine mammals, and then if you're an Inuit, you know, the humans who are at the apex of that particular food chain. And again, I'm doing a little bit of a digression here, because in nutrition, there are no straight lines. Everything connects. You have to ask yourself, how is it possible that these extraordinarily fragile, very easily oxidizable molecules can make such a long journey, which can take at least 12 months, and you're going through 5 or 6 trophic levels? And the answer is that the marine algae that produce the omega-3s are also producing these phenomenally effective amphiphilic polyphenols called fluorotenins. Very lipid soluble, and that's quite a rare characteristic in the polyphenol empire. But so they stick with the lipids and they co-partition with them from the marine algae into the gut, and then the tissues of the krill, the gut, and then the tissues of the small fish, and so on and so on and so on, until it's all the way through into the final apex predator. And that's where the whole fish oil industry has gone wrong, because the fish oil industry, which was really started by 2 Danish physiologists, Bang and Dorberg, and they went over there to the Inuits and they said, well, it's got to be something in their food. It's got to be one thing, because they were thinking like pharmaceutical people. And they pulled out, you know, the omega-3s, and they were half right, but completely wrong, because omega-3s on their own don't do it. It's a binary weapon. And you have to have these chaperone molecules together with the omega-3s to ensure that they get into the blood. And then that's not enough. That's just primary bioavailability through the blood system and into your cell membranes. So back to the olive. The olive is a bit like the marine algae. It contains a group of polyphenols, which, like those in the marine algae, are amphiphiles, which means that when you eat them, they are extraordinarily good at chaperoning these otherwise very easily oxidizable fatty acids. And they will help you to get your strategic omega-3s, if you're taking them to the right place. They will deliver them into the cell membranes. And once they get there, these polyphenols put on their other hat. They then start switching off the inflammatory cascade downstream from the omega-3s. And it's that combination of the omega-3s switching off the cascade at the top, the polyphenols coming in much lower down, and switching off the matrix metalloproteases, that gives you such good anti-inflammatory cover. And that is the secret, part of the secret of the Inuits' freedom from chronic degenerative disease, and the effectiveness of the Mediterranean diet in doing something similar.
Great. So put a stake in the ground for us, Dr. Paul. What should the ratio be so that people can say, okay, I'm going to be doing the test. It's very new in South Africa. We're very grateful for it. What should the ratio be? Give us a little bit of a range, for because some people are not going to get all the polyphenols. And then how do we measure if someone is getting enough polyphenols in the diet?
Right. Well, let me answer those questions in sequence. What should the right 6:3 ratio be? I think if you're not eating really a lot of polyphenols, I'm talking now about something like a traditional Indian diet, then you should ideally have a 6:3 ratio that is south of 5 to 1. And if you already have chronic inflammatory stress, which is driving a particular degenerative disease, you may want to bring it substantially down below 5, below that. So if you have essential hypertension, what we find is that that's a reflection of chronic inflammatory stress in the vascular endothelium. That will go into remission once you bring the ratio down to about 3 to 1. If you have an autoimmune disease where, again, the tissue, the target tissue is being destroyed through a process of chronic inflammation, you probably need to come down to 1.2, maybe 1.5. And at that point, that chronic inflammatory sequence stops as well. So those are the ratios that you should take into consideration. In terms of polyphenol status, it's actually very difficult to measure. And there's a lot of debate amongst the polyphenol experts is how you can you can best do this, because we talk as if there's one kind of polyphenol. There's not. There's many hundreds of different kinds of polyphenols, and some of them are hydrophilic and some are lipophilic. A very small number are lipophilic. Some are amphiphiles. And that will determine whereabouts in the body they go. And the fact is that many of the polyphenols that we thought were acting as anti-inflammatories by acting systemically are probably acting through modification of the microbiota. For example, we see that in the epidemiology of multiple sclerosis. It's a fascinating subject. And so there's no point in trying to measure them in blood because they're not getting there in any significant amount. You're talking about postbiotic modification of various disease states. So there isn't one, it's not like putting a dipstick into an engine and measuring the oil level. It's just not that simple. There isn't one particular convenient biomarker. I am particularly interested, as I've tried to explain, in the amphiphilic polyphenols because they're such good chaperones for omega-3s. And if you can measure them, the best way to do it would be in the lipoprotein fraction.
Are you talking about particle number and size, or are we talking about oxidized LDL, or what?
No, you're actually talking about using forensic analytical technology to measure the polyphenols themselves.
Okay.
You will actually see them
in the lipoproteins.
Yes, you will. Yes, you will. If you're taking the right types, if you're taking the lipophilic, amphiphilic polyphenols, you will see them there. Okay. But you need very special technology to be able to do that. And we are actually working with an independent forensic analytical laboratory at the moment to develop ways of doing just that. We want to see what's going on. And I'm expending a lot of effort into trying to drill down into this.
Okay. So I had a decent question there to see how we can measure that. I think that's obviously something that you've been working on then. And tell me about this, the omega-6s. Is it more important about volume and concentration or ratio? Because I've done a lot of tests over time and the omega-6s are really high. You can pop the omega-3s up and the ratio can improve. But is it also about the volume and concentration that we should be focusing on?
Looking at this symptomatically and clinically, in the old-fashioned way, what I see is that once the ratio starts to drop below 5 in most cases, and then with certain conditions, bringing it down below that, you start to see symptomatic improvement. Whether the omega-6 levels have actually changed that much. Now, I think what this means is we have to move away from thinking about the cell membrane as a homogeneous pool of 6s and 3s. I don't think it works like that. I think that it may be more helpful to think of these free fatty acids in the membrane in a series of semi-independent pools. So the 6 pool is filled up. The 3 pool in most people today isn't. If we fill up that pool of 3s by bringing in exogenous omega-3 HUFAs, complete with the amphiphilic polyphenols, that will shift the ratio. And that seems to be enough in most cases to bring these chronic conditions under control and to basically to force them into remission. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying this is all we have to do. I'm not saying it's pharmaco-nutrition versus pharmaceuticals. It really isn't like that. This is not a simple adversarial binary model that we're talking about. I believe there will always be a place for pharmaceuticals. When patients come to see us, they're in pain, they have symptoms, we have a duty of care to them, and the best way to treat those problems in the acute sense is to use pharmaceuticals, which work very quickly, they're very specific, extraordinarily toxic, as we all know. But I think it's absolutely acceptable and rational and appropriate to use pharmaceuticals to manage our patients' symptoms, while at the same time introducing these far more profound pharmaco-nutritional programs, redressing the underlying pathology and getting to a point where we can start to taper off the pharmaceuticals. Then you have the best of both worlds. We are using pharmaceuticals in the way that they should be, and by reducing patients' exposure to them over time, we reduce, as you well know, the risk of adverse effects.
Brilliant. Now, how do the people out there that are listening, Dr. Paul, trust a company with omega-3s? Is there just it's really, there's a cloud over omega-3 companies and what they're producing, and are they rancid, and are they pure, and, you know, have they been heated, and just all the ins and outs of that. What does the person out there do? I mean, obviously I've tried many other brands before. I think the test has helped. I think that's a really good way to see what's happening if the omega-3s that you're consuming are correct. But we don't know about toxicity and what else is in there. What does the person out there do practically?
Let me again answer your question by taking a step back. Do fish oils work? And I think if you look at the Cochrane collaboration perspective, the answer would be, well, not really. The big meta-analyses indicate that the fish oils, at least those fish oils currently in the market, don't do very much. They don't seem to be hugely positive or hugely negative. If you want to go out and buy some and put them in your pocket and even swallow a few, well, you know, they work. It's a bit like carrying the bones of the saints around with you. It's a good anxiety binding, but it won't do very much for you. And yet the epidemiology says very clearly, if you're eating fish, and particularly the oily fish, and that comes from the Zupfan study, it's really, really good for you. So there's this huge disconnect. How is eating oily fish good for you and fish oil isn't? And the answer is, well, they're not the same thing. There's things in fish, in oily fish, which aren't in the fish oil. Those are these really interesting polyphenols. And I would say to people who are interested in omega-3s, well, it doesn't really matter if they're free fatty acids, esters, phosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidylphosphatidyl they'll get into the blood by the primary bioavailability. Any mug can do that. Once they get there, a lot of them are broken down before they can be incorporated into the cell membrane. And we know this because we've got this huge database now of dried blood spot tests where we look at people's 6-3 status, their fatty acid profiles. And we know that in the general population, the ratio is about 15-1, which is pro-inflammatory. In people who eat fish oil, it's about 12-11-1. So it's a little bit better, but it's still pro-inflammatory. In people who eat oily fish as a staple, and in North Europe, you'll find groups like that, the ratio is down to about 3 or 4, and they don't get chronic inflammatory diseases to anything like the extent we do, maybe 10%. And if you look at the people who take balance oil, which combines the same omega-3s and the same polyphenols, it's also down about 2 or 3, and they don't get chronic degenerative conditions either, except at about 10% of the rate of what we see in the outside world. And I want to come back to that 10% figure. I think I mentioned that when I talked about the mid-Victorians. If you ask the oncologists, the cardiologists, the neurodegenerative guys, how many of your patients have strong genetic risk factors? The answer always comes back, we think about 10%, which tells you that about theoretically 90% of the disease that we see is avoidable. And guess what? That 10%, that figure comes up when you go back to your vestigial groups. The mid-Victorians, the Hadza, the Tsimane, they get cancer and heart disease and dementia, but only at about 10% of the levels we do. And the only lesson you can draw from that is, by golly, it's only that 10% have got the risk factors, the genetic risk factors who are manifesting and developing these pathologies. Everybody else is protected. And I think that's really, really a wonderfully optimistic way of looking at things, because it's telling us if we can get the nutritional goalposts in the right place, we could reduce the burden of degenerative chronic ill health in first world nations by that same percentage, by about 90%. Stopping chronic inflammatory stress, which I think we can do, in fact, but I see we can do it using this oily fish in liquid form, which is what balance oil is. And then stabling the other 3 horsemen with other quite different sets of tools gives you a pre-transitional nutritional environment and a pre-transitional health expectancy. That's where we're going with this.
Sounds good. And let's move on to the other horsemen in terms of glucose and just metabolizing glucose. And I love your comments on fasting, because it's been something that's been really beneficial for myself. I've worn a continuous glucose monitor for probably 2 years. I've monitored things like beans and peas and kale and spinach juices that have really just shot my glucose up significantly. And I've stopped doing those just because I've seen the markers. My fasting insulin is probably between 3 and 5. And I'm going to give a little bit of a personal narrative because I think it's important for people to relate to. So the insulin is kept very, very low. My HbA1c is under 5. I'm carrying probably about 10% body fat after doing body compositions over many years. So firstly, you've already said to us how important glucose metabolism is, and sort of having glycolytic variability or metabolic variability, being able to possibly start burning your own body fat and producing ketones, and that. Give us an overall view, what people can do, what you think about fasting, CGM as a way forward for many people, because I found that very beneficial for my clients and patients. That they can see what fasting does, they can see what smoothies do, they can see what these green juices often do, they can see what certain foods do. It's been a very good measurement for myself in my own sort of medical journey.
Well, I know that we've got to the point now where a lot of people think that digestible carbs are a really bad thing. And glycemic control is something we should all be focusing on, and fasting is a great idea. Let's unpack that. Do you remember the first food pyramids?
Yeah. What are you talking about in America? The first few pyramids with the grains at the bottom?
Yeah, but those first few food pyramids, there was a rationale behind them. Because if you remember, the very first one came out of Crete.
Okay.
And it came out of Crete because Crete at that time was the nation that had the lowest incidence of heart disease in the world. And they were eating lots of carbs. How do you reconcile those facts? Because now we think, oh, carbs are bad. Well, the answer is that the Cretans' population that they were looking at were physically very active. They were fishermen and farmers, and they were eating lots of carbs, not simple carbs. They were sort of slow carbs, if you like. But those carbs, which were pouring glucose into the bloodstream, it was all being utilized. It was not creating hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia. We don't know. I don't know what their HbA1c levels were, their levels of glycolytic stress, glycative stress. But clearly, if you look at their public health profiles, they were really healthy. The Victorians also eating lots of carbs, absolutely, huge amounts. But they were physically very, very active. The navigators, these are the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic pecking order. They're the people who dug the ditches, built the aqueducts, bridges, and laid the railway tracks that transformed the face of late 19th century Britain. They were consuming about 9,000 calories a day. And we know this. I mean, it's all extremely well documented. And they had fantastically good health. You have to be healthy if every day you're going to dig with your hands 20 tons of earth and rocks and clay out of a trench and pile it up onto the ground behind you.
Sure.
So I'm not necessarily I don't think fasting is actually necessary if you're physically very, very active. I don't think carbs have to be avoided if you're physically very, very active. Okay, fast forward. We're not working as navigators anymore.
Okay, but let's just stop there. We're talking about unprocessed carbs, because once again, that's the filter. Once again, everything has to be unprocessed. If it's processed, you're going to have the same problems, even if you're physically active.
That's partly true, but I don't think that processed has to be bad. I don't think ultra-processed has to be bad. The technology exists now to make modern, addictive, ultra-processed foods, which are not bad for you. In fact, it's perfectly possible to make ultra-processed foods which are functional and pro-health. And I'm talking to individuals in the food industry, in the flavoring industry, who are very acutely aware of this and who are starting to explore this area. So
most of those current processed foods now are filled with omega-6s. They've got the soybean oil, that people think that canola oil is healthy, and they think a lot of these omega-6s that they're using, and they don't even look at what's actually in the processed carbs. And it's got all these, even the bread has got soybean oil. So it's really important to understand those processing, mechanisms that introduce omega-6s into almost every single processed package.
I agree with you. And I think that where we are now, processed and particularly ultra-processed foods are strongly associated with reduced health and life expectancy. There's no two ways about that. What I'm just saying is that ultra-processed does not have to be unhealthy. And there are people in the food and the flavor industry who I'm now communicating with who see this and who are beginning to think, well, maybe we can start to make ultra-processed foods which pack a real pro-health punch. And the problem now becomes political once again, because they are saying, well, we'd like to be able to do this. We can begin to see how we could do it. What could we say about our foods? It would make the foods a little bit more expensive. We could recoup that if we could sell more of them. But the regulatory system, FDA, EFSA, have been deeply corrupted, completely co-opted and compromised by the food and pharmaceutical industries. So you now have this regulatory system, which makes it impossible for people in the supplement and, more importantly, in the food industry to be able to say, this is going to do something really good for you and to give you protection against this, that, and the other. They can't do it. So we can talk about this between ourselves. But
I do want to talk about the Cretans, because the Cretans and Icarians and the Cypriots, maybe it wasn't the food so much, but it was the work and labor needed to produce the food. And now when you take that away from the person and you give them a process package, they're not spending the actual labor to produce their own food, which is so important to keep that constant glycemic level.
That's yes, I agree with you there. And that kind of brings us back to fasting, because right now we're surrounded by easy access calories of the wrong kind. And if you go back to the Neolithic era, and you don't have to go that far back, that was a period when food security, which many of us take for granted now, was really not available to anybody. Everybody lived with food insecurity. And so whether you wanted to or not, it was feast and famine, feast and famine, feast and famine. You'd eat the food when you had it. You'd try and put some away. You'd try and preserve some of it. But then there would be a gap, a period of time. You did not know how long before the next meal would come along. And it's very obvious that when you go through a period of famine, fasting, intermittent or not, that the body regards this as a stressor. And it has hormetic effects, leading to the upregulation of various processes in the body, which are extremely good for you. Now, we've left all that long behind. We're eating all the time. We've hardly fast during the course of the day at all, perhaps only for 6 hours out of the 24 when we're sleeping. And I think there's a very strong case, especially for people who live relatively low physical activity lifestyles, to go in for at least intermittent fasting. So perhaps extend that period when you're not eating. It seems to be a minimum for 14 hours. If you can go to 16 hours, that seems to be better. That ends up with all kinds of metabolic improvements. And you see people with a whole range of clinical conditions getting and feeling a lot better once they shift onto that kind of schedule. Plus, of course, it's good for weight loss. There is a body of recent research that shows that if you extend that and go in for either a period, I think it's of either 5 days once a month or 4 days once every 2 weeks of calorific and protein restriction, you actually are able to force many disease processes to go into remission, and in some cases to start going backwards, up to and including various cancers. So I think the idea of intermittent fasting is very attractive. And of course, that feeds into your narrative, your ideas about glycation, the glycation index, and levels of glycative stress throughout the 24-hour period. I think if you're constantly experiencing glycative stress, you are going to see an accumulation of damaged proteins, which will manifest in different ways: increased arterial stiffness, which you know is not a good idea, but all kinds of problems elsewhere, including in the brain. And if you give it a rest, if you give the body a rest, a period of 16 hours in the day, when you're not hammering it in this way, you're giving those proteins a chance to reassemble, to self-repair, and to be replaced by other functional, healthy, and unglycated proteins. Which is going to be good for you all the way through from your arteries through to the crystallines in your eye and a whole range of other tissues as well. So I'm with you on that. I'm with
Brilliant.
you. Absolutely.
Well, let's get some of your numbers, Dr. Paul, on what hyperinsulinemia, I think, is even sort of a more important measure for people to look at. They're fasting insulin, and have a look at that significantly over time, because I think that's a real early sort of precursor of disease. But what would your numbers be on a fasting insulin and HbA1c? What sort of spikes in glucose of millimoles per liter would you not want to see if someone did a CGM? So that's that one area that I want to look at before we move on.
I think I'd ask you that same question. This is not really my area of specialization. I will tell people in almost every case, look, stop eating simple sugars and usually, I mean, if you really absolutely have to have, that sweet in your food, opt for one of the rare sugars. For example, aloes. Now, aloes, which is not particularly well known. I think you probably know about tagatose and allulose, which used to be known as psychose. Aloes is even more interesting because aloes is a sugar that has about 90% of the sweetness of table sugar. It doesn't have some of the off notes that allulose has. Not everybody likes allulose. But the most important thing about aloes is that it seems to trick the body into thinking that it's experiencing calorie restriction. So you get a lot of good things coming from that. And it has been shown to have some very potent anti-cancer effects. So you can add sugar into your cookies, into your coffee, enjoy them, but at the same time, know that you're taking very significant chemoprotective steps. We need to move away from sucrose, that's for sure, from, I think, fructose as well, considering the new data linking it very clearly to increased hepatic lipogenesis. And, that feeds into this NAFLD problem that I was talking about earlier. A lot of this work has been done by the University of Kagawa in Japan. Ken Isamore, who gave the enzymatic process its name. It's called isomoring. And it's a way of producing these formerly rare sugars in very large and therefore commercially reasonable amounts. You're going to see more of these entering the marketplace. And I think I would say to people, look out for them. They will help you to bring your insulinic responses down. It will help to drop your HbA1c. They're going to be protective in that respect. But if you look for aloes in particular, that looks as if it brings a whole raft of chemoprotective benefits along with it as well. So you can still have your cake and eat it.
Okay, let's get your inflammatory markers, because I think this is important from HSCRP. My own personal narrative, and I'd love your opinion, is I try and keep it well below 0.4. My HSCRP, looking at T3 and reverse T3, the ratio of under 20, which I think is another important marker. And other interleukin 6, interleukin 10, those type of inflammatory markers, as well as oxidized LDL and lipoprotein little a. Tell us how important these inflammatory markers are, because I think they should be something that people out there that are really concerned about their health or want to optimize their health or want to prevent disease should know.
I think that here is where we part ways. So I'm not convinced that they're that important. And the reason for that is I don't think that they're sensitive enough. I mean, yeah, you can use HSCRP if you want, and you'll pick up someone who's got acute pneumonia, but that's when you've got really a large amount of pretty serious inflammation going on. The types of chronic inflammatory stress that will, over a period of 50 years, lead to the erosion of enough of the trabeculae in your femoral neck to create a hip fracture, that level of inflammatory stress, you're not going to pick up unless you actually go and take a biopsy. If you want to say to me, look, you have to pick a marker, I'd probably pick VCAM1. If you have chronic inflammatory stress anywhere in the body, you're probably going to pick it up in the cardiovascular system before anywhere else. Whether it's been caused by dysbiosis in the gut, endotoxemia, and then that will manifest in the bloodstream. If you are eating a lot of advanced glycation end products and lipoxidation products, and you're eating a lot of lipopolysaccharides, and of course you see all of these in ultra-processed foods today, you'll pick that up in the bloodstream as well. The bloodstream is actually a pretty sensitive marker. And that's why essential hypertension is come to be seen as an intrinsic element of the aging process. Well, you don't get essential hypertension if you're a Hadza or a Tsimane, and they didn't get it in the mid-Victorian period either. It is a sign of chronic inflammatory stress, and a very sensitive one. So I would say, if you want to be academic about it, pick one of your VCAMs or ICAMs, and that's really a lab-based method. Or we can be old-fashioned doctors, and we can just look at diastolic blood pressure. If your diastolic blood pressure is starting to creep up, you have endothelial dysfunction, except in a very small number of cases where you've got a renal or an adrenal or a hypophyseal issue. But if it's essential hypertension, and in the majority of cases it is, just use your old sphygmomanometer. And if you see that diastolic reading start to creep up, you have chronic inflammatory stress. And if you have varicose veins, and if you have hemorrhoids, and these other signs are the same thing, you have chronic inflammatory stress. We can go back to being good old-fashioned doctors once again and actually take the time to look at our patients. These are simple measurements.
Good. I've got two more questions. I know we're coming to the end of the show and I'm really appreciative of your time. But one is, I had Dr. Thomas E. Levy, who wrote The Hidden Epidemic about periodontitis. And he came on the show and just really gave us a lot of the science. He's written an incredible book called The Hidden Epidemic, and why most cancers and heart disease comes from your mouth, and the change in your mouth, your microbiome of your mouth, the infections that are there, atypical periodontitis. Tell us how important that is, because there's a mainstream narrative out there from dentists and oral surgeons that, you know, it's not important when people are putting, you know, root canals in. It's not important that you've got an abscess. It's really a very localized problem. It doesn't have a significant systemic, you know, deleterious effect on the body. What are your thoughts, Doc?
I would say the evidence that it is not a systemic problem are overwhelming now. And increasingly, the doctors, the dentists that I talk to are really aware of that. We know that periodontal disease is a risk factor for Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism, and actually quite a lot of the machinery of that has been investigated. And it's also a risk factor for pancreas cancer, resistant hypertension, and I think breast cancer as well. If you have dysbiosis in the mouth, then you're producing on a constant, pretty much constantly, these inflammatory mediators, and you've got some really nasty bacterial metabolites that you're swallowing, but there's also evidence that they're passing retrograde through the olfactory nerve, getting into the brain and wreaking havoc, absolute havoc there. The link between dysbiosis and Parkinsonism is proven now. The link between oral dysbiosis and other dementias, including Alzheimer's, I think are almost equally strong. It's clearly as important as dysbiosis in the gut.
But then, Doc, why are these dentists still doing root canals, which have been shown to really just, you know, pack in the infection? Why are they still, you know, not looking at a view of ensuring that, you know, your mouth microbiome is good by not using things like fluoride? There seems to be no change with regards to a lot of the interventions that they've been doing for many, many years. And I'm not talking about the very small percentage of biological dentists out there. But if it's periodontists or prosthodontists or maxillofacial surgeons, they're taking out a wisdom tooth, they're not cleaning that area, and then we get this osteonecrosis or this fatty jawbone osteonecrosis there, and so that starts manifesting over time in terms of you know, endogenous infection and inflammation. It seems like their interventions are continue as they always did.
Well, you know, medical institutions and dental institutions are like oil tankers. There's a lot of normalcy bias. You practice the medicine or dentistry that you were taught, and it's very difficult to change course, to persuade people to change course. They've got a series of techniques that they've developed and which work, at least in the short term, and they don't necessarily, they're not aware of, or they don't particularly care about what's going to happen to that patient 10 or 20 years downstream. That's not their responsibility. That's not how they're taught. So you were asking them to really change their entire philosophical approach to the work that they do. The numbers of people who have moved on from that, they are small, but I do see them increasing, and I speak to an increasing numbers of them. We do have one or two pharmaco-nutritional tools, the tools that we can bring to bear here as well. And one of them in particular I'd like to talk about, which these are the antiadhesins. The problems will very often start, or they'll be exacerbated by the formation of biofilm or plaque on and around the roots of the teeth. And that provides a home for these microbes where they can settle in. It will then turn over time to tartar. And this is absolutely an integral part of this process where you're moving towards progressive dysbiosis, progressive inflammatory stress, progressive increases in the amounts of inflammatory mediators and bacterial toxins that you're producing in the mouth. So wouldn't it be nice if instead of just going to the dental or a hygienist and having your teeth scraped once a year or once every 6 months, which I never enjoyed, I was trying to put off, if there was an easy and painless way to do it, and it turns out that there is, and this is derived from polysulfated oligosaccharides that you find in marine seaweeds, which the seaweeds produce as anti-fouling compounds, so that barnacles and other forms of life can't settle on them. When you eat these extracts, they're fucoidans, then they get into the bloodstream. You actually do absorb significant amounts of them. They get into the bloodstream, into the intracavicular space, because it is secreted by the salivary glands. They bathe the roots of the teeth, and after 24 hours, most of the plaque will disappear. And you can test this for yourself using plaque disclosing tablets. And then the really interesting things start happening, because after 2 or 3 weeks of this, these molecules are getting in between the lamellae of the tartar. The tartar softens and just falls off the roots of the teeth. So it's like going to the dental hygienist, every day. And you have that, that slippery, slimy feeling that you have on your teeth when they've just been cleaned by the dental hygienist. I have that all the time, because I take these seaweed extracts. And this is a way of preventing the development or the progression of gingivitis, periodontal disease. The mouth goes back to the normal, the bleeding stops, the pockets actually start to grow out. And that's really extraordinary. And some Japanese work shows that if you can stop this inflammatory stress, this progressive erosion of healthy dental tissue in the jaw for long enough, some kind of healing or regenerative process takes place, and teeth that were formerly very loose start to anchor themselves back into the jaw. An amazing thing. And
Doc, I've got to take you on this, because I've had a 3D cone beam a scan, and where my 2 wisdoms were taken out 25 years ago, quite clearly on the scan, you can see this osteonecrosis or this fatty tissue there. It's very different to the rest of the jawbone or the mandible. So are you saying if I take this product for 3 months, 6 months, I do another cone beam, there's a good chance that actually that could change?
I have no idea, because I haven't seen I haven't seen patients like that. What I have seen are people saying to me, "Well, my teeth were starting to they were starting to shake loose in their sockets, and now they're sitting there nice and firm." So some regeneration is taking place. Wow. I think the ligaments that actually anchor those teeth into the jaw, somehow under these conditions, if you're not continually destroying them and damaging with chronic inflammatory stress, there seems to be a possibility of a degree of reconstruction. That's all I can tell you. I don't think anybody has looked at this in a systematic way. At Zinzino, we have started to do prospective randomized clinical trials in areas where we already know we're going to show positive results, for example, in essential hypertension. We have a pipeline of trials which we're going to initiate once this first one has been completed. And I'm actually pushing for one of those to be a study of periodontal disease, looking at what happens, measuring the disappearance of plaque, tartar, measuring pocket depth, measuring bleeding on probing, and subsequently looking in more detail at the level of integrity of the tooth and its attachment to the socket in the jaw. All of this will come. Zinzino has been a fairly small company up until now, and the people who ran it, I think, have integrity, but they don't have a galenic background. They weren't really thinking about it in these terms. When I went to them, I said, look, I think we can do something really important here. They were selling coffee when I first found them, when they first found me. I think we could become a life science, evidence-based pharmaco-nutritional company. That's where we're going. And one of the elements that is going to be a part of this progress, that already is a part of this change, is this pipeline of prospective randomized clinical trials, double-blinded, placebo-controlled, all the rest, where we can prove formally what we're already seeing in our individual patients and customers.
Sounds good. And I want to connect you with Dr. Dome Nishvitz. He's biological dentist in Europe. He wrote a book called It's All in Your Mouth, and he talks about this fatty, degenerative, osteonecrotic jawbone. I think he's got thousands and thousands of scans of people's mandibles. So I think that would be a really good person. He's got a very strong natural medicine background. In fact, he's a naturopathic doctor as well as a dentist. His dad was a biological dentist. He's working with a doctor called Ulrich Volz in Europe. So I think there would be some good connections there, because he's got a lot of these patients over many, many years. And it would be, I mean, I'm going to try it now. I'm going to get Zinzina, I'm going to give it a go. And possibly before I do the whole procedure of, you know, cleaning it out and then putting the PRP in and then using ozone and then closing it over. And then you need IV antibiotics as well. You got to make sure there's not an infection there. You got to rescan later as well to make sure that fatty tissue is being dealt with. It's a whole procedure. But possibly I can try this, and we've got now a scan that we can possibly compare to. I would probably think 6 months is something that on the product that would be necessary.
I think I'd probably agree with you. And that raises another more general point. I think that a lot of clinical research that is going on at the moment is really damaged by sample error, because you're looking at a profoundly diseased, malnourished population. And I think that this has really badly affected, it really damages and degrades the validity of a great deal of clinical research that is done both, well, certainly by the pharmaceutical industry.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But by clinicians in general.
It's crazy. I mean, I look at GTT and I look at it, and it's just got to be under 20, and the range is just increasing and increasing and increasing. You look at TSH, the same thing, the range is increasing. Why? Because the sample groups that they're using, these people are sick individuals. Instead of keeping the TSH at a certain level, the ranges are just going out of control here. But anyway, that's another topic. I really want to thank you for your time. Last question for Dr. Paul Clayton. What question have I not answered that you would like to answer?
Do I see any light at the end of the tunnel?
Go for it, Doc. Tell me.
Well, I mean, to quote Game of Thrones, winter is coming. We're in for a very difficult transitional period. And I think everybody knows that there's a global economic meltdown in our very near future. I think we also know that our governments are extraordinarily corrupt. They're basically criminal enterprises. I think that possibly I can see something on the other side of this, which could be better if we can move on from the institutions which are now so important, many of which have their roots in the 19th century and are completely outmoded. They're no longer fit for purpose. So we have, you know, the pharmaceutical industry, we have the food industry. You can trace it back to its origins, and they don't work for us anymore. Neither do our political institutions, neither do many of our economic models. There is something on the other side of this. And I would just say this, I'm a keen student of history. And if you look at that period in European history, at the end of the late Middle Ages, before the Reformation, the Renaissance starts, it's characterized by insanity, by melancholia, the dance of death, the ship of fools. It's a period when people understand that the old order is crumbling. They can't yet see what the new one is. And so they become hysterical. Children's crusades, like, you know, Antifa, Black Lives Matter. The people are running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And I sort of understand it. I can see some aspects of the outline of what this new system might be, but it's not very clear yet. I think it's going to become clearer over the next couple of decades if we survive. And I think that maybe something better lies on the other side.
Sounds good. Well, I declare favor and blessing over you, Dr. Paul Clayton.
Thank you.
Your dreams, your aspirations, the things that you want to do that are deeply, you know, your desires would come into fruition, and that you would carry on doing the pioneering work that you're doing. I'd love to connect again. I think you could really help a lot of South Africans and Africans here. We've got the good, the bad, and the ugly, but thank you so much. And I wish you well in your endeavors.
Before I say goodbye, I would love to come back to South Africa. My dad came from Ashawi in KwaZulu-Natal. I'd love to go back there and perhaps give something back in some way.
Beautiful. Well, you've got a home here in Johannesburg. We love having international guests, and Kirsten Pierce and Samantha Pierce are very good friends of ours, and we've got a close relationship. So there's always a home for you to stay in, and welcome you and distribute you along our network that we have here in South Africa, so that you can experience the glory of Africa, the glory of the sun, and a lot of the things that in sort of westernized countries do not have easily accessible. So anyway, thank you so much, and hopefully we can chat again.
It's been a pleasure.